Thank you, Carmencita, for wrestling through some heavy names. All right. I am excited for camp. Noah takes off today as Pilgrim Pines opens camp. My family as halfway through their camping season. My wife returned yesterday from a middle school camp that got closed about a half hour earlier than they planned because of wildfires. They had to bring campers down to the ranger station for parents to pick them up because the mountainside on that part of the hill was closed. So far, Pilgrim Pines has not been threatened at all. They're on a separate side of the mountain from where the fires are. But it got me thinking about my time as a camper and as a counselor. I remember new songs along the way. There were always old songs it seemed we had always sung, even before I'd ever been there. I seemed like I knew those songs. I remember the first time we sang Sanctuary as a camper. You all know I'm not much of a singer, but the words have always stuck with me. Lord, prepare me to be a sanctuary, pure and holy, tried and true. With thanksgiving, I'll be a living sanctuary for you. I only changed key twice during that, I think.
Nice voice.
Thanks.
Nice.
I remember learning it as a camper. I remember singing it as a counselor. It had become a traditional favorite in a short amount of time. I remember singing Sanctuary then, every year at camp, every youth Sunday at church, every youth retreat I've ever been to. I remember singing Sanctuary. There are some times when it gets warm outside, or there's a campfire or something, or just a lot of fire on the grill, and in the back of my head I hear, Lord, prepare me to be a sanctuary. It's a song that has been there for so long. Sometimes it makes me think, Lord God, please send us a new song. But if nothing else, the times the song has gotten stuck in my head, the times that I've been forced to wrestle with the message over and over, to hear it echoing, it made me think about a word that I often took for granted. Sanctuary. Sanctuary. To be fair, the song opened my eyes to the meaning of the word sanctuary. The one in my home church, our sanctuary, was a big space with hardwood floors, hardwood pews, beautiful brick walls, and the ugliest stained glass green you've ever seen. It's hard to imagine an uglier green that we were more emotionally attached to. It was our sacred space, and I remember the pain in all of our hearts when we decided we were building a new building that would be handicap accessible, that wouldn't have all kinds of weird architectural features, and wouldn't have leaks everywhere. We were thrilled with the new opportunity, but sad to lose our sanctuary, our sacred space. The one in my home church, honestly, for me, was not as important as the other spaces I was losing. It was the sacred space for my grandmother, for her friends, for a lot of our families. For me, it was the long, quiet place. It was the place that the grown-ups made you sit still a lot. It's the place where an adult talked. It was the adulting room. I preferred to hang out in the youth room, where we had a pool table and foosball and ping pong, and we could talk loudly and not be heard in the sanctuary. Not that we ever snuck in there during church. I preferred to hang out in the church basement where we had fellowship meals, where my uncle, the church custodian, sat with his comic strips, the funny pages as we called them in that part of the world, and sometimes I would skip church to go down there. I remember hanging out in the church nursery or in the craft room. Even the church office was more exciting to me than the sanctuary. You could talk to people. There was something happening, something going on. But as I've grown older, as I've looked back on the meaning of the word sanctuary, it wasn't just the boring adult place. To others, it meant much more. It was the place of their wedding. It was the place of their grandparents' funeral. It was the place of their baptism or their children's baptism, or those sacred moments where they sat with God. It was the place of the cantata, the chorale. It was the place of the Christmas Eve service and the Easter morning celebration. It was the place they marked time and God's presence. For others, it meant even more. It was a place filled with promises for the future. It was a place overflowing with grace, free from judgment. It was a place where God met them in their distress, in their confusion, in their pain. It was a place they sat to wait on the Lord's presence to be known to them. It got me thinking about the other ways we use the word sanctuary. I remember as a child watching old Zorro reruns. The sanctuary of the church is where Zorro ran to get away from the guards. They wouldn't go in, out of respect for God. In The Hunchback of Notre Dame, it's where the hunchback took refuge. He found sanctuary, literally in the sanctuary of the church, as a social outcast. It's a place where he could find safety, he could find aid, he could find protection from the world around him. And then beyond the church, think about how we use the word sanctuary beyond the church. Refugees seeking sanctuary from war, poverty, from disaster. And that is exactly where our story meets us today. That is exactly where we find our characters in this Bible story. Today we're picking up a story, the last story that we get in Scripture from the time of the Judges. We've had all these other characters in the book of Judges, but in that same time period is the story of Ruth, and it gets its own book. Elimelech is kind of the patriarch of this story at the beginning. He's taken his family from Bethlehem, where there is a drought, to Moab. In Hebrew, the word Bethlehem literally means house of bread. House of bread. And so they leave the house of bread because why? There's no bread. There's a famine. There is no bread in the house of bread, so they are forced to go seek food elsewhere, to sustain his family elsewhere. So he goes to another country. He's peacefully welcomed, it seems, into Moab. There is no war. There is no violence. There is no fear of ice at the door. He's welcomed into a new place where his family is given an opportunity to thrive. Unfortunately, Elimelech dies. He leaves his wife and 2 sons who take wives in that land. They've made themselves a home there. 10 years later, both sons die. And our story shifts from Elimelech and his sons to the widows, to Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah. An immigrant woman whose children have died, now living in a strange land with 2 other women. In that time and place, women did not have the security that we see in our world and culture today. They were dependent for identity and protection, for income and economics, very often on the men around them, especially this far back in our history. So Naomi steps up to lead the family, and she tells the 2 daughter-in-laws, these 2 young widows, go back to your fathers. You're young enough that your fathers might marry you to someone else. I know we scoff at the concept, but that's how it worked back then. That's how they might find security. As they got old, a place to be cared for. If nothing else, they would be cared for and fed in their father's tents, in the family that lived together agriculturally. Or there might be a man he could marry them to. Orpah finally accepts the wisdom from Naomi and says, you're right, that is the best thing for me. And there's no way that Naomi can care for her. Staying with Naomi would actually stretch Naomi's resources even thinner. Orpah agrees to go home, but Ruth stands her ground and says, no, where you go, I go. Your family is now my family. Your God, my God. Wherever you're buried is where I'll be buried. We're together for this. It is not a surprise that these readings from Ruth, although shared between 2 widows, A mother and daughter-in-law is often used in weddings today because of the covenantal nature, the vows that are made between Ruth and Naomi. They travel back together to Bethlehem because the drought has ended. There's once again bread in the house of bread. The fields have grain again. And so they go back to Naomi's home. But what does that make Ruth? An immigrant. A widow without a family who comes as a refugee from another place, from a different reality. We don't know the backstory to Ruth. We don't know if there were other factors that kept her from wanting to go home, or if it was just her devotion to Naomi. We don't know if it was a fear of what waited on her in that place, what she may have escaped, or if it was just a faith in God to guide her in this new place, in this new family role. But she then steps into a new place, a new culture, a new reality. And Naomi goes as her guide. Naomi teaches Ruth the tradition of gleaning, how widows, those who did not have enough, could go behind the workers in the field and take the scraps, take the leftovers. And so she sends Ruth as an able worker out into the fields. Naomi sends her to glean, to find food for them to live on. Ruth finds the fields of Boaz along the way and works there. Boaz is actually family of Elimelech, so family of Naomi. Ruth finds the fields of Boaz, and along the way finds favor in the eyes of Boaz. Boaz sees her hard work. Boaz sees Ruth's devotion to Naomi. He also sees her pretty smile, the way she tosses her hair, the way the sunlight shines off her skin. Oh. Ruth has found favor in the eyes of Boaz and sanctuary in his fields. Naomi guides Ruth through the customs of the day, not just the gleaning, but how to get yourself a man. By the end of the harvest, there is a celebration. And Naomi starts coaching Ruth. Get cleaned up. Get dressed up. Naomi tells Ruth how this is all going to go down and prepares her for what's to come. And every time I read this, I can't help but think of the song Fancy in the back of my head, the old country song. If you've not heard it before, go listen to it and see if it doesn't sound a little similar, pulled from the book of Ruth. Naomi tells Ruth, wait for the end of the party. Wait for the men to all be happy. And then go to Boaz. They'll all sleep there, she tells them. At the end of the party, they'll just lay down on the piles of grain. They'll lay down there on blankets on the threshing room floor because they'll all be a wee bit inebriated. And nobody wants to get arrested for riding your donkey while intoxicated, right? They'll all settle down after the party. Go at night, she tells her. Wait till it's dark. Wait till everyone has laid down. And then go lay at the feet of Boaz. And she does. She does. In the story, it's phenomenal as we read it. She goes and she lays at Boaz's feet. And all of a sudden, he wakes and says, who's there? And she says, it's me, Ruth. Throw your cloak over me. And he does. And the next morning, he's ready to marry the girl because she slept at his feet. For those of you trying eHarmony, for those of you who've been on Christian Mingle, give it up, find a Naomi. Apparently, she is the relationship whisperer, the master matchmaker. She can tell you how to get that partner. Maybe not ethical in our world today, but she's got a way about her. The next day, they have to sort through some issues. Boaz is ready to marry Ruth. You know, the girl from the field with the hair and the eyes and the skin. But there's a tradition to be followed. This is an old system Naomi's been kind of navigating here. She knows how it works. It's the same one we've heard in other scripture stories. If someone died, their brother would take in their wife. And if they didn't have children of their own, the brother would take that wife and have children with them in the name of their brother. So the descendants then would be the brother's children through her, not the one who was actually the DNA parent. If there was no brother, it went to the next relative down the line, the next male relative, to stand in, to have children in their place, so their inheritance continued. Remember, this is a time when they had not had land of their own for very long. What belonged to the people was precious, and they were trying to keep it within the family of faith, within the tribes. So Boaz knows there's a relative who is one spot higher up the chain than him in closeness to Elimelech. He goes to them and says, listen, Naomi has a little property left if you would like to buy it. If you don't, I will take it and redeem that land to keep it in the family. And then this next of kin says, well, sure, I'll do that. And he goes, by the way, just so you know, Ruth comes with it. Whoever redeems the land also takes Ruth as a wife. And the guy goes, whoa, 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 whoa. That's drama in my family I don't need. You go right on ahead there, Boaz. So Boaz does. He marries the girl, and they live happily ever after. Isn't that a lovely story? It's a refugee and immigration success story. A family takes refuge in Moab till things get bad. Then a non-traditional family immigrates back to Bethlehem where things are hard but good, at least for a few generations. Ruth's great-grandson David has aspirations of being king, but he finds himself often living in exile. Because the current king Saul sees him as a threat. David spends a chunk of his young life living as a refugee under the care of others. And then Ruth's later descendants find themselves living under Roman rule, with Herod as a governor. One young couple in her genealogy, down her family tree, find themselves in the midst of scandal, pregnant with the whole town talking about who the real father might be, because they weren't married yet when she got pregnant. And there's been a death order put on the child. So Mary and Joseph take their baby Jesus and live as refugees, immigrants in Egypt for a while before returning home to Nazareth. They live as refugees in a strange land. Later in life, that same child teaches us stories, tells the good works of refugees, immigrants, foreigners, Samaritans, Syrophoenicians, and others. Then he dies, but he's resurrected happily ever after. Isn't that a lovely story? A refugee and immigration success story. The family finds refuge in Egypt, then the non-traditional family comes back home, where everything will never be the same. The refugee becomes the Prince of Peace, proclaims love for all God's people, and all is well. At least it should be. At least it should be. Lots of people today are still seeking sanctuary. People today are still looking for sanctuary. Some are spiritual refugees. They are escaping an abusive culture of faith. Words and actions that beat them down, that make them feel less for who they are. It's a spiritual refugee crisis for many as they flee churches, seeking the love they've heard about but yet to experience. They need a safe place to rest their souls. They need a safe place to listen for God anew. Some are social refugees, societal refugees, escaping a culture of judgment and blame. They need a safe place to rest their hearts. They need a safe place to be loved again. But some are physical refugees, escaping lives we struggle to understand, escaping problems we prefer to forget. As a church, as a people of faith, we are called to respond, to offer sanctuary. Let's be clear, this is not a political term. Sanctuary, regardless of what we hear on the news, is not a political term. We had it first, okay? That's what we've named the place we worship for generations. We had it first, and they can't have it. We're not going to let them change the meaning of the word. Sanctuary is a safe place for those in desperate need to find refuge. Sanctuary is a place where everyone is loved and finds the grace of God. Sanctuary is a place to rest your feet, your heart, your soul, and find the help you need. A place we respect because God meets us there beyond the structures, customs, and issues of our political divides. Sanctuary is that safe space, and the political world cannot have that word. It's ours. It is a spiritual term. It's ours. It's not a political issue either. It is a spiritual issue. It is scriptural. Our scriptures are dripping with conversation about sanctuary. Our news cycle is filled with opinions, filled with propaganda, and stories, positive and negative, about immigrants. But our scriptures are filled with teachings, with examples, and also stories about immigrants. Stories about immigrants. Hospitality to those in need, and even hospitality for those who are not in need. Compassion for those who are widows and orphans. Compassion, even for those who are not. Sanctuary for those who have no place to stay, even when there is no room in the inn. Remember the stories we celebrate in our faith family. We look down on the innkeeper for not letting Jesus be born in a room. We're not giving Mary and Joseph shelter, right? We lift up the innkeeper who works with the Samaritan to give the beaten man on the side of the road a place to stay. That's the heroic example. In our scriptures, we lay out the spiritual nature of the conversation. It's our story. No one else can have it. They can participate in it. They can become part of the story. But we can't allow it to be hijacked. It's a spiritual term, a spiritual issue. Our scripture is filled with teachings, examples, and stories about immigrants. There are no easy answers to the political messes we live in. There are no easy answers to the economic problems that our world faces. There is no easy answer to the violent battlefields, the frightened families that in our world are each seeking sanctuary. But we can't ignore the issue because it's our story. It's in our story. It's core to the story of God's people. We can be a safe church for those who've been hurt by church, and we should be. We can be a safe church for those who've been hurt by others, and we should be. But we must also offer sanctuary to others who are in need, and if possible, maybe solve the problems they're trying to escape. We need to be willing to talk about the problems that lead to refugees, that force people to live as immigrants. We must talk about issues. That means war across the globe is a church issue. That means natural disasters are a church issue. It means drug wars in other countries become church issues here. It means human trafficking is a church issue. It means fair trade is a church issue. We can't sit silently while a neighbor's home is destroyed and then be surprised when they come and knock on our door looking for help. Some of these issues are global. Some require a geopolitical engagement from our nation, from our leaders, from our communities, even from our church. Some of these issues will be raised by candidates for political office, and many of us may have disagreements on how to approach those issues. But before any of that, before we get into the minutiae of the solutions, we have to name that these are also spiritual issues. And we must do what we can do to help others. We must be part of solutions in big ways and in small ways. So where do we start? Here is a modest prayer for each of us. Lord, prepare me to be a sanctuary, pure and holy, tried and true. With thanksgiving, I want to be a living sanctuary, God, for you. Amen.